welcome. I think some of the topics we're going to discuss today around university research have been alluded to or hinted at during the last several conversations. But what I want to do maybe to start the conversation, I'm going to pick up on what you said in this last session when you described somebody who maybe thinks of a university in the context of their own personal experience, right? And maybe it was their fraternity or their classes they took or their favorite professor. But I'm going to venture a guess and say that most people, on average, don't know a lot about the university's research complex, right? You maybe didn't touch it, you don't know about it, never mind the outputs. Can you start, President Crow, with just a shaping of the situation? What is this thing called university research?
So it's kind of funny. I mean, so in our society, as we have evolved, the universities have become what's called adaptive organizations. So our role is to take the knowledge of the past, store it in both libraries, other information sources, and in faculty members. To take that knowledge from the past and then synthesize it, evolve it, make it available, to create new knowledge, to add to the basic stock of knowledge, and then to find ways to transfer that knowledge, both in the form of educating students and then also transferring that knowledge in the form of new things, new theories, new tools, new devices, new systems, to make all of that happen. Just at ASU, a single American research university in the top 100 of American research universities, we have one of the 50 largest libraries in the world. We have tens of thousands of people involved in research. We subscribe to tens of thousands of academic journals. We contribute to tens of thousands of academic journals. We are involved in all aspects of this. And so if you look around the world, there's 300 institutions operating at that level, maybe. Those institutions hold in them the entirety of what we understand, not in terms of tacit knowledge, the knowledge that we have as individual humans, not in terms of culturally specific knowledge in the way that, maybe communities are run around the world, but this notion of what we understand about nature and so forth and so on, it's in these institutions. And so these institutions are the embodiment of, our adaptive understanding of nature, and that's what these research universities do.
And maybe, can you put any numbers to how much this is integral to the university? How does it play out? Is it just a side project over here and then we get the benefits of those outputs?
At a big research university like ASU or University of California at Berkeley or Johns Hopkins or Columbia, where I used to be the chief research officer, it is the monster within the institution. It's the tail that wags the dog in many ways. It's billions of dollars of expenditures at some universities, $1 billion at ASU. It's unbelievable facilities, unbelievable production of thousands across these institutions of PhDs per year who are then embodying the new knowledge going forward. These are massive, massive things. Let's go back to my old school at Columbia. At that time when I was there, we had 4,000 or so students in Columbia College, a small elite honors college by its design. There were, 30,000 employees at that time just in the medical school. And of those 30,000 employees, half of them were involved in research at that time. And so these are massive, massive, massive undertakings. In fact, in the last 80 years, the bulk of fundamental research on the planet is done in American universities.
And maybe, Paul, I can have you pick up there. It seems to me, looking at your background a bit, you went from a bunch of different experiences around universities, but more specifically around entrepreneurship and invention, and found that being in a research institution and thinking about the research side actually was a piece to the puzzle for the innovation you wanted to drive. Can you talk a little about your own progress and then what you saw or see in the value of the university research?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think, Michael, earlier on you were asking about how many times you get the question of, what do you guys do during the summer? It is really very true. People think that the university kind of shuts down, but the university is this unique place where it is 24/7. People are always working, whether they're teaching or engaging in the research enterprise, and it just doesn't stop. And that's one of the reasons I came back, because I was in a company. It was in Sanofi. It was actually, the original company was called Chatham, acquired by Sanofi. And it was a wonderful experience to see how science can be done at scale in a reproducible way to create real meaningful products to the world.
Well, that story about how you went from your, describe your PhD and then why you went to the company and what you did, and describe that stuff. So.
Yeah, so I got a PhD at Rice, and now I work at Rice, but my PhD is in fundamental chemistry and physics. It's nanotechnology, so I worked for a Nobel laureate at Rice, and he was wonderful, Rick Smalley, and I learned how to make very, very small things to make great technology. That's great.
But how small?
Nanoscale small, so it's 10 to the minus ninth, right, meters, but that's going to get into a real rabbit hole that I don't want to go into, but extremely small. But those features and that kind of emergence of quantum phenomenon comes from nanotech, right? And so nanotech was actually, in many ways, born at Rice. My late mentor discovered the buckyball. Now, when he was doing the buckyball, it was really, he was looking at solar plasmas, right? He was just studying, exploring. And then they came upon something called the fullerene, the buckyball, which is a soccer ball, but it's carbon atoms arranged like the stitches on a soccer ball. That's a brilliant thing, and then that opened up a new vista of opportunity. And we started creating companies, and he was actually a pariah in the university at the time because doing startups inside of a university is actually a closeted activity. And what Rick did was he was not a shy guy. He actually, you remind me a lot of Smalley. He was somebody who pushed the edges. And I think that was very important. And I learned that, but then from that, I went back to industry. After I got married, I thought, well, why don't I get a real job and have a family and leave academia? But when I went to the industry, I learned a lot of interesting things, especially how to take science to scale. And that was the beautiful thing that I got out of industry. And I never really trusted science as much as I do now after seeing it produced and actually affecting people's lives. So then I came back to the university to see if we could do something more, kind of bring back that knowledge and then infuse that into the university and see what we could do. So I had the opportunity to come back to Rice and then been asked to now lead our innovation enterprise at Rice.
Yeah, so I'm glad you took us there because the panel is about, first of all, the invisible hand. What is this thing called a university research program, but also how it drives innovation. And when President Crow and I first met, I had just finished a stint running a program at Stanford connecting industry interest with the research around future of technology at Stanford. And at the time, my thinking has evolved a bit, I had thought about this challenge of establishing what the ROI is, right? And everyone would nod from industry and say, ROI, that's awesome, you're finally talking about return on investment. And to the business person, I'd say yes. But to the professor, I'd be saying, no, we're talking about research of interest. You're pursuing questions that drive you. And then why would government get involved? Well, they want results of importance. They're trying to move society forward. And when I say my ideas have evolved, it's a lot in part by working with President Crow and ASU because all three of those should be something that everyone's thinking about, right? And so inside one university, if you're thinking about all three of those objectives, and this is the way it manifests itself in ASU's mission around we are responsible for the communities and for the outcomes, et cetera, then all three of those become important. So maybe I can shift us a bit, following on your thread around innovation, and talk about what has come from university research. What have we seen and that maybe people don't even know to appreciate? Because I think that's one of the hard things. In a number of sessions you've talked about, doing work that's invisible or delayed gratification for 20 or 30 years, but when you're doing it, no one knows it matters. How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's kind of weird. So we think of inventiveness by what we can manifestly, visibly observe. So we think about the plow that somebody invented or the tool that someone discovered and invented. And so what people can't see, it's this invisible hand notion, is that the role of high-speed technological development and technology advance in the United States used to explain, in 1900, it explained about 2% of economic growth. Right now, it explains about 85% of economic growth is derivative of some kind of technological advance. And then what people also don't realize is that they used to think about technological advance. They think about Alexander Graham Bell, building the telephone, or Samuel Morse inventing the telegraph, and they think, well, that was the machine, that was the technological advance. And so now it turns out since 1990. The vast majority of technologies, the vast majority of technologically based patents are now based on fundamental academic science. You can't do the patent without having some understanding of the molecule or this or that or the nanostructure or some paper by Smalley and his group at Rice University. And so all of the patents that then have evolved around the processing of nanosystems or the building of nano production tools. And so I was at Rice a few weeks ago and I took out my iPhone like this and I said, oh, by the way, everybody thinks this is the genius of Steve Jobs. Yeah, it is the genius of a designer and an integrator of technologies. But even since I gave that this little blurb, I said, well, there's thousands and thousands of academic papers that are in the 10 classes of technologies that are in here, and in the 100 sub-technologies that are a part of those 10 technologies that are in the iPhone. I went back and looked at it. It's many more than that. I mean, it's tens of thousands of academic articles, tens of thousands. It's at least 4,000 academic research groups over decades that laid the foundation from which this technology could emerge. And because it's so many groups over such a long period of time, and it's one step followed by another step, followed by another step, followed by another step, followed by another step, it's literally invisible to anyone that's out there. So Paul, I'll just ask you, for instance, what has happened in your area of science since you were active in your area of science? Just as an example. So you wrote a dissertation.
Yes.
Your major professor won a Nobel Prize. There were lots and lots of articles. All of that led to even some of the things that are involved in these technologies. But how much has changed even since you were a student?
Oh, goodness gracious. The ability, so like what's packed into the iPhone in particular is very interesting. The chipset features that we're building and now scribing into these chips are at the nanoscale. We're able to actually make nanoscale materials in a very sort of scalable way. That was because we were studying this inside of universities for decades and decades. And so your comments were so resonant, and I think that's why it's a viral video, right? So many people know that this is true, and you put it in a way that was very, very clear. For example, like I was looking back, after you had said that, I was looking at the iPhone. Not only did we make the nanoscale features and all these sorts of things in the Gorilla Glass and everything you mentioned, some of the patents came out of University of Kentucky, which is my alma mater, right? The capacitive touch, right? That didn't have a practical application immediately to mine, right? But
no, because some crazy professor was working on something about touching something.
Touching something, that's right. Because, nerds are better at sort of remote touching. They don't like to actually interact with people.
All right, I'm going to move the conversation along.
This is true. I mean, we don't. And so you're in your hovel.
Screens.
Yeah, you're in your hovel, and you're working on some curious problem, right? And then somebody picks that up, and that's what's happened. The problem with this sort of model, and I think this is one of the challenges we're facing, is that we want to be able to do it faster, right? Don't wait for a long period of time, but you have to study something deeply in order to actually make it. And that's what we did in nanoscience, right? It was nanoscience and technology that really drove us to get to the point where we are. And we're seeing that both in chemistry and physics and all sorts of materials. But how do you actually accelerate? One example of that, for example, we all went through COVID, right? We wouldn't have gotten out of COVID if it wasn't for university research. It just would not have happened. We would still be in the same sort of bubble that we'd been living in with masks and everything else that we had associated. But it's because of mRNA that was studied for decades before that we were able to get out. And what really happened on the acceleration was it was an infusion of capital and a sort of accordion-like contraction of the process so that we could get out. But if we didn't have the research coming out of universities, it wouldn't have happened. And that's a big aspect of it. And one of the reasons the United States is still known as a great innovative country is because of our universities. It's our universities that have been driving that engine. And people don't know it, but they need to know it, and I think we need to tell that story more.
Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, if I summarize what I'm hearing where I think we are, universities have a lot of rationalizing to do, both in terms of how poorly understood they are, or appreciated, or let people judge whether they should be appreciated, but at least give them the fact. And so that's kind of the PR problem, and the self-reflection about what we could do differently, given the current times and what's needed with the world that's changing so quickly. And so can you think or talk about what you're thinking through in terms of what do you do tomorrow? You run an innovation program at Rice. You're driving a lot on different fronts across ASU. whether it's the PR side, again, I don't want to be too crass and just say, oh, just
Yeah.
talk to people, but
Well, the one thing that we have to do is we have to find ways in which we can always explain what it means. So I'll give you two examples. So two labs that are run by the University of California, one in Livermore, California, one in Berkeley, California. At the Livermore lab, there's a facility there called the National Ignition Facility where they have the most powerful lasers in the world. And they can create using this laser energy. The lasers were, of course, developed by Charles Towns out of Columbia University 65 years ago. But they use these lasers to recreate the actual dynamic physics and chemistry of a star in combustion, which is called fusion energy. And so they create a fusion event. So 2 years ago, at this National Ignition Facility at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, they made that happen in a way where they produced more energy than it took to create the event, thus demonstrating with certainty that we have the capacity to design and operate small stars as an energy source. Now, there's all kinds of ways that you could make that into the coolest story imaginable, that we just had this breakthrough and it will lead to this kind of outcome in 20 or 30 years because we had this breakthrough and this is what was involved in it and so forth and so on. Billions of dollars of expenditures, tens of thousands of people. Probably that event was as significant as the 1942 chain reaction in the stadium Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, in which we learned about chain reactions of atomic material. Now, because there was a war on, that was secret, nobody knew. You ultimately saw this bomb. We defeated the enemies of democracy. We made these things happen. Everybody was cheering, blah, 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 blah. But now 80 years have passed, and we're no longer attempting to explain things to people in ways that they understand it. Just more recently, at another lab run by the University of California, in Berkeley, California, right up the hill from the main campus, they decided, oh, by the way, to do a small little thing. Why don't I create an element that doesn't exist in nature? I'm going to create this element, 116 is its atomic weight. Oh, by the way, this particular element will have the features of its chemical structure, which will make nuclear waste a thing of the past. Unbelievable. Unbelievable science. I mean, we're creating elements that nature doesn't even create. And so we've become this, we can create stars, we can create elements, we can change the future, but back at the ranch in academia, there's a total lack of ability to understand how to communicate this. It's like, well, it worked this time, it might not work the next time, so then there's the doubters. Then there's the people that say, well, they're too stupid to understand it anyway, why would we explain it to them? And so then there's that mode, and then there's, well, how do we actually explain it? So how do you actually explain that we created a mechanism by which we can create a small star as a source of power on Earth or orbiting the Earth as a source of power? How do we explain that to people? Now, they see it in science fiction, but they have no understanding of what's behind it. So we are unbelievably bad at explaining why we're doing things. And that is one of the biggest problems that universities have. The gap between what they're doing is very different than what the gap was in 1880. And so that gap just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, and the people keep falling further and further away from understanding what's going on.
And fortunately, Paul, I think that's in your job description, is to close the gap and help figure that out. What are you actually doing day to day? How do you bridge that so that it actually turns into innovation, not just...
I thought it was interesting. Just describe something before you do this, because you and I have talked about this. So how'd you end up at the University of Kentucky, and why were you living in that part of the world?
Oh, well, yeah. So going back even further, so I'm an immigrant. I came from India. My family moved to the United States, and we settled in Kentucky. Originally, it was supposed to, so that my father was a surgeon, and he wanted to go serve in the underprivileged region of West Virginia and Kentucky. So I lived on the border of West Virginia and Kentucky. We went back there to establish some clinics and some aspects of that. And I ended up staying there. Our family really grew up there, and it was a wonderful time just growing up in Appalachia. And so I'm from a deep part of Appalachia that J.D. Vance doesn't go to, so I'm very, very proud Indian hillbilly. And it's a really interesting kind of thing, but that's the American thing, right?
Yes.
You import talent. It's a great magnet for this, right? So we were there, and then from Kentucky, I was doing some research there that caught the eye of people at Texas Heart Institute in Houston. And so they wanted me to stop and take a break from medical school at the time. And I had said no originally to doing that. I wanted to finish medical school. But then it was on the same day as 9/11. So then I left med school and said, okay, I'm going to serve my country for a year and go start this company. And so I did that in Houston. Ended up meeting Smalley in Houston, and he said, why don't you quit medical school and be a real doctor? So I did. And then the rest was history for me to really go into Rice. But it gave me this ability in academia to be able to explore, like crazy stuff, right? The stuff we were doing and still are doing. There's some really wild stuff that happens in academia, just really great thoughts, great ideas. Like, for example, what you just mentioned was brilliant. Here's another one that we never talk about publicly. So muons. Muons are fundamental particles. They're electrons. Electrons are part of that kind of universe. So if you can think of the periodic table in chemistry is really the story of the electron, right? So if you can do chemistry, you can move electrons around, right? Well, what if you changed the electron and made it a muon, a much heavier particle? Now you can hack the periodic table. This is stuff that people do in academia. No company would ever touch that, right? Because that's not where they go.
And only one person in a million understands what he's saying.
Exactly, right. This is the problem, right? But you want those crazy people who think of something, who have a deep understanding in it, and then communicate it back out. And that's one of the things that academia allows you to do. But we don't do it well on the comms, right? We don't really kind of disseminate it and speak to people with clarity. Some people do. Those are the outliers. But can you actually do that in a bigger way? I get that question all the time in Houston when we're doing these innovations at scale. So a lot of my job is to really kind of build the infrastructure for our faculty and students to do that. Then we set them loose, right? Remove the obstacles inside the university to get that out. But a lot of the job is also very much interacting with leadership across the United States and around the world. I do a lot of work in DC. I do a lot of work in Silicon Valley. We're talking to venture capitalists to try to accelerate our innovations. But all of that is really with the purpose of unlocking what we've discovered in the labs and then trying to get it out to people. That's not the easiest thing to do in this sort of castle that we've built inside of academia. But one of the things that we're doing at Rice, and it's mainly because we have new leadership with President DeRoche and our provost and all of our leadership coming together saying we're not going to do it the same way that we've done it. He wanted to do innovation at scale. I think a lot of it is examples that you've set, Michael, that we can actually do more for society if we come out beyond our hedges and really kind of build these innovation campuses. So that's what we've done in Houston. We have 16 acres of the Ion, which you visited. It is an incredible place, a playground for us to be able to develop new ideas and take it out of the labs and into the real world. And that's something that we're very proud of. And Houston is the largest city in the state of Texas. And I think it's a great partnership that we can forge with different universities, especially ASU, to do that.
Yeah, and in that context, how do you think about the role of the university needing to do more versus figuring out the interface between university and industry? And so, like, does the university or the researcher have to be all things to all people, or do they have to make themselves more accessible so that the venture capitalist can come in, or that the student can leave with their invention and go grow it in the world?
So the university researcher needs to be put into a situation where they are unencumbered. They don't need new languages. You don't need to train them in new ways. They need to be able to focus on that which they are uniquely qualified to do. And then around them, there needs to be these, in fact, they need to be as unencumbered as is possible. They need to be given what they need. They need to be left alone. They need to teach their students, and then it needs to be really others that are out explaining the why, explaining what it means, helping to build the linkages, helping to make these things happen, so that those individuals which happen to be operating at this level, like your major professor, so he's an individual who could do something that no one else could do. When you have someone that can do something that no one else can do, you should let them do that.
Yes, that's right.
And then there were the people that built him. you know, the science that led into what he was able to do. So you need to let that system run, but we need to find ways to hold it much more accountable for, in my view, very, very important is American success. And that means making certain that these technologies that might emerge, making certain that this scientific underpinning leads to solutions, because the scientists will just be interested in for the most part, just interested in the curiosity. Someone else has got to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, that someone else is the big critical part of it, right? I think universities that have now sort of reconstituted themselves in this sort of reformation moment that we're having is, how is it that we can help get that information out the door and get it to the world? Instead of waiting 100 years for your innovation that's been published in a paper that barely anybody reads, how do you actually get it out? And that's absolutely right. We have to let these extremely talented individuals be able to do what they do. And then as a university, we have to build structures to enable others to take it forward. We've studied entrepreneurship very, very deeply for decades. It's not the professor that actually does the company, right? It's the students or the postdocs or the people that they've inspired to go out and take it into the real world. And that is not only good, I think it's actually needed. It's a social contract we've had with the United States government since the end of World War II, that we would get funded by the feds to be able to do the work and then give back and provide goods and services to society. We haven't directly done that. We've done that through papers and patents and people that we produce. But can we do more? And I think that is something that we're connecting up to, and that's where the innovation side.
So the point that Paul was making. So during right as World War II was evolving and the Americans were about to enter the war, President Roosevelt talked to a guy who was the head of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, who had been the vice president for research at MIT in the 1930s, who had been the founder of the Raytheon Corporation decades before that, who was a double degree graduate of Tufts University, who then became an MIT professor, a guy named Vannevar Bush. And Bush created a structural design in which he said, I will find a way to tap into all of this talent in academia so that you will have some chance of accelerating the means by which we can win the war with the fewest casualties possible on the American side. And the result of that was so astounding, was so overwhelming, the things that were built from proximity-based fuses to cryptographic code activities to atomic weapons to all kinds of other things, that at the end of that they said, well, we've got to keep this going. So that was 80 years ago. This is this contract that was made. Now that's run its course. And that needs to now be reset and redesigned and reinvigorated, but it doesn't do away with the fact that once tapped into, these universities then produce things, oh, by the way, the internet, semiconductor technologies, semiconductor processing, microchips, theories, all the things that are going on.
I'm going to throw in the social sciences too. As a PhD in psychology, yes. I think, one of the things, my whole career has been about leveraging technology, so I'm a big believer that is a lever for good in just about every discipline or arena. But the interesting thing is the social sciences, if you can't get somebody to adopt the technology or believe in it or trust it, it doesn't matter. And so other areas, I think...
Trust in particular.
Trust in particular, and that's where some of the other research, again, it's not the sexy thing that I've got my phone in my pocket and I can do something new, but in concert, I think those are working. So new regime, new world order, new need for a contract. Any last words about what that looks like? What would you advocate for? How do we make it clear how compelling a proposition it is? Whether to the students we're trying to get to be the future researchers, whether to the faculty doing the research, whether to the people believing in the universities and trusting that goodness is
everything has to be explained so that my dad, after he left the Navy, was a truck driver. So that my dad could understand it. My dad was a smart guy, but he wasn't well educated, and so he didn't. But he did understand what things meant. Mm-hmm. And so if we cannot explain what we're doing to everyone, then we're failing, number one. And number two, we've got to understand that this needs to lead to better outcomes for everyone, not just better outcomes for rich people.
Yeah. To add to that, I think there was a Feynman quote about this. Richard Feynman was a famous physicist and educator. He was saying if you can't explain something simply, you simply don't understand it, or some version of that. The idea is that we have to very clearly articulate what it is we are doing. I think trust is a big issue right now, and I think you can only build trust through relationships. And if we wall ourselves off, we're not building those relationships with society. I think there are incredible heroes inside of academia. And that's the kind of thing that we need to show people, who our heroes are, what we're doing to help save the world with what we do every day. As soon as we show that, I think a lot of people will come back and see the deep value of what innovation really means across the United States.
I think that's a great note to end on. So if you can join me in thanking both our panelists, and we'll call that a wrap.